Some names carry a weight far heavier than they seem. A weight soaked in fear, loss, and sorrow. For Sarah, the name Isobel would soon become one she could never forget, no matter how hard she tried. This is a story of terror, isolation, and the unforgiving wrath of something long forgotten. Sarah had never heard of Isobel before she moved into her new home. The house was nestled in the countryside, far from the hustle of the city, surrounded by a dense forest that stretched for miles. It was an old, dilapidated cottage that had been left abandoned for years. Despite its worn exterior, Sarah had fallen in love with the place at first sight. The sense of peace, the towering trees, the quiet that seemed to wrap around her like a protective blanket, this was what she needed. A fresh start after years of heartache. The realtor had offered the house to her at a shockingly low price, warning her about its history. The house was rumored to be haunted, but Sarah didn't believe in such things. She shrugged it off, convincing herself it was just another urban legend. After all, every old house had its stories. The first few weeks were quiet, almost too quiet. Sarah spent her days cleaning, unpacking, and trying to make the house feel like home. But there was one room she avoided, a small, windowless space at the back of the house. The door was locked when she moved in, and though she had the key, something about the room unsettled her. Whenever she walked past it, a cold breeze seemed to brush against her skin, even though there were no windows. She figured she'd deal with it later. But that later came sooner than expected. It started with soft whispers in the middle of the night. At first, Sarah thought it was the wind rustling through the trees. But then the whispers grew louder, more distinct, as if someone was murmuring just outside her bedroom door. She could never make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, and filled with sorrow. She'd wake up, heart pounding, only to find nothing but silence when she went to investigate. The nights became more restless as the whispers turned into faint cries. The sound seemed to come from all directions beneath the floorboards, behind the walls, and sometimes even from the locked room at the back of the house. Sarah tried to ignore it, tried to convince herself that it was just the old house settling. But deep down, she knew something wasn't right. One cold, stormy night, everything changed. The power went out, plunging the house into complete darkness. Sarah fumbled for her flashlight, the sound of the rain pounding against the windows making her feel more isolated than ever. As she moved through the house, trying to find candles, she heard something. The distinct sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, and heavy. She froze, her heart racing. The footsteps seemed to echo through the hallway, growing louder as they approached the locked room. Sarah turned, her flashlight trembling in her hand, and for the first time she felt a bone-chilling fear. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Then, a soft knock echoed through the silence. Without thinking, Sarah ran to the door. Her hand shook as she inserted the key into the lock. She didn't know why she felt compelled to open the room, but something deep inside her urged her forward. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark, cold space. The air smelled stale, and the room was empty except for an old rocking chair sitting in the corner. As Sarah shone her flashlight around, her beam landed on something strange, words scratched into the wall over and over again. Isobel. The name was scrawled all over the walls, carved into the wood with such force that splinters stuck out around the letters. Sarah's pulse quickened, her breath catching in her throat. The name looked familiar. She couldn't place it, but something about it tugged at the edges of her memory. She was about to turn and leave when she noticed something else in the room, a small, dusty mirror leaning against the far wall. It was cracked, with a large web of fractures spreading from the center. As she stepped closer, the air grew colder, and for the briefest moment she swore she saw a shadowy figure in the reflection, a woman, standing behind her. Sarah whipped around, but no one was there. The room was empty, but the air felt thick, oppressive. She backed away, her eyes fixed on the mirror, and then the rocking chair began to move slowly, back and forth, creaking with each sway. The whispers returned, louder this time, and they came from the chair. Suddenly, Sarah remembered. Isobel. The name was part of the legend the realtor had mentioned. The woman who had lived here years ago, before the house was abandoned. Isobel had been a recluse, a woman shunned by the local village, accused of witchcraft. They said she had lost her daughter in a tragic accident, and ever since she had been searching for her. wandering the house late at night, whispering her name. Sarah bolted from the room, slamming the door behind her. But that night, the dream started. The next morning, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. As she prepared her breakfast, she caught glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eyeshadows flitting across the walls, disappearing when she turned to look. She started to hear faint sobbing throughout the day, like the cries of a child. It seemed to follow her, growing louder as night fell. Desperate for answers, Sarah decided to do some research on Isobel. She drove into the nearest town and visited the local library, where she uncovered the tragic history of the house. Isobel had indeed lived there many years ago, but her story was far more sinister than Sarah had been told. Isobel had been married to a man who was said to be cruel, and after years of abuse, he had taken their daughter from her. The loss drove Isobel mad, and in her grief, she turned to dark rituals in an attempt to bring her daughter back. The townspeople claimed that Isobel had succeeded at a terrible price. The daughter returned, but she was not the same. Isobel kept her locked in the small room at the back of the house, the very room Sarah had unlocked. The whispers Sarah had heard were the cries of Isobel, still searching for her lost daughter. But it was what came next that terrified Sarah most. The townspeople had sealed Isobel and her daughter inside the house, leaving them to die, trapped in their own torment. The haunting grows more intense as Sarah realizes she has unintentionally unleashed something far darker than a lost spirit, a vengeful force that feeds on her fear. The longer she stays in the house, the more dangerous it becomes. The shadows in the mirrors grow sharper, and the figure of Isobel appears more frequently, always watching, always whispering. Sarah's final battle with Isobel comes when she tries to leave the house for good, but Isobel won't let her go so easily. The house becomes a maze of terror, trapping Sarah in a nightmare of twisted hallways and locked doors, her only hope of survival lying in unraveling the mystery of Isobel's past before it consumes her completely. There are some names that carry the weight of a curse, and once you know them, they become impossible to forget. Isobel is one of those names. Remember it. Or better yet, forget it if you can.